But as part of that, there was a 77-day-long siege of the Quezon combat base, which was up in the northwestern corner of I Corps. And I have a number of books on the siege. I go to libraries a lot, and one time there were libraries discard books. And it was one time all these 25-cent discards from the Vietnam War. And I have, I think, at least 100 books on the Vietnam War. And I have a number of them on the Quezon battles. But it was the defining moment of the Tet Offensive. Well, that and the battle for Hue City. But I arrived in the Quezon area right after the siege. Operation Pegasus was the breaking of the siege of Quezon, and I was part of Operation Pegasus. The 26th Marine Regiment were the main occupiers of Quezon during the siege. The entire regiment, 26th Regiment of Marines, that's 3 battalions with all their support troops, and 1 battalion of 9th Marine Regiment were the ones that there during the siege. We got there, first Marine Regiment got there after the siege. So we took over the whole area from the 26th Marines. Quezon Combat Base was just one element of that. It was surrounded by a number of hills, and on a half a dozen of those hills were permanent emplacements, trenches, bunkers, where we occupied. So I was on several of those hills. Hill 881 South, there were 2 881s, a south and a north. South is the one that had the permanent emplacement, and that was in the news earlier on a lot. There was a lot of battle going on Hill 881. But when we got there, I was on 881 for a while. I was on a couple of the others, and the defining moment was on Hill 689. That was up until the middle of July of '68 when Quezon was abandoned. So I was in Vietnam from October '67 to August of '68. And in July of '68, Quezon was being abandoned, all the hills were being abandoned, and we had a lot of enemy activity and casualties in those last couple of weeks on Hill 689. And that's where I got my small shrapnel wound. I got a piece of shrapnel in my upper right butt or lower right back, wherever you might want to anatomically call it. I was trying to recover the body of one of my assisting gunners. I was gunner, I was a corporal, so I was the gunner. I carried the 3.5-inch rocket launcher. And we eventually transitioned, before I left Vietnam, into what was called the LAW, the LAAW, Light Anti-Armor Weapon, which was a smaller one-shot rocket launcher. It's what Rambo used to shoot helicopters out of the sky with, if you ever saw the Rambo pictures. But we would carry a number of those instead of one 3.5-inch rocket launcher with a number of rockets for it. It was a reloadable weapon. But the LAW was not reloadable. You used it once and that was it. While I was in Vietnam, I was gunner throughout the whole thing because I was a lance corporal when I first got there, and I had a couple of private first classes, one at a time during my 10 months as an assistant gunner. So my squad, made up of machine gunners and rockets, there was just 2 of us in rockets. There were a couple of machine gun teams. There were like maybe 8 machine gunners in the squad, but only 2 of us rocket men. And I was the gunner. I would have 1 assistant gunner, and that was it. During my time in Vietnam, I remember having 3 assistant gunners, 1 at a time. 2 of them got killed, and 1 shot himself in the foot. So, you know, I saw a fair amount of action, but luckily lived through it with just that 1 small shrapnel wound. And of course, whatever mental wounds I carry. But Hill 689 I didn't bring it with me, but I have a letter. My mother saved all the letters that I sent home. I was always sorry that I didn't keep a journal while I was in the military, especially now that I'm thinking of writing a book that would help. But in a way, I have a journal because I have this whole stack of letters that my mother saved and gave to me. And there's one letter that I wrote home at the end of the 689 action where I was fairly graphic in what we had just been through. And when I read that letter, I'm amazed at how graphic I was, because we lost like 80% of our company on that hill during the 6 weeks we were there, especially that last few weeks. And it was my family knew that I was there on Hill 689 because I had told them in a subsequent letter that I was there. And it was big in the news. There was lots of news articles and television about Hill 689. So they were worried. And when I left the hill, I mailed off this letter. And I didn't there's a lot of stuff I wanted to bring with me, but I was just telling these guys before the interview started, my wife was admitted to the hospital last night. So I've been a little preoccupied. She's okay. She's got some kidney malfunction, and yesterday she wasn't doing well, so we took her to the emergency room. But I've been interviewed by the Rutgers Oral History Archives a couple of years ago, and that took 5 interview sessions of a couple hours each to do the whole thing. So I would think I would meet with you guys again at some point, and at that point I'll bring more things along and show you, and I'll show you a copy of that letter, and I can give you a copy of that letter, and I can give you some of these pictures if you're interested in having stuff to go along with this recorded interview. But my father sent me what was known as 126 Instamatic cartridges. It's a film cartridge that you drop into a camera, take the pictures, and then send the whole cartridge off to be developed, so you never saw the film. And of course, you guys have never seen film anyway, right? But this is me on Hill 689. Can you see that? This was a day or two after I got my little mortar shrapnel wound on my back that the corpsman just put a Band-Aid on. So you can see I haven't changed a bit, right? This is my first beard. We had no water up on that hill. Very little water. We were there for 6 weeks. The rifle that I'm holding is what was known as an SKS. It's a Chinese rifle that I had taken from an NVA who didn't need it anymore. But that was on Hill 689, Quezon Outpost. And then when we left Hill 689 and got back to Fubai, rear area, and got cleaned up, then this was me. After I got cleaned up, I kept the mustache. So that's my first mustache. My granddaughters look at this picture and they say, "Peepaw, you were good looking. What happened?" Are these showing up in the camera okay? And then this is earlier on in Vietnam. We were building bunkers, and you asked a question about bunkers. So I built a fair number of bunkers. I was 140 pounds and 6'2" when I joined the military, when I joined the Marine Corps. I was 160 pounds when I got out 2 years later. So they put 20 pounds of muscle on me. There's no fat there. My wife has done a much better job of bulking me up. So that's just a few of the pictures that I took while I was there. So I have a lot more than what some people have. My life after the military has been, I would have to say, fairly stable. My wife and I have been married 47 years. We have 3 kids and 6 grandkids. And I've been able to hang on to all my stuff. The house we live in now, we've lived in since 1975. It's got too much stuff in it. But I have all my military stuff. It's scattered, and I have to search for it when I'm looking for things. And sometimes it takes a while. But a lot of veterans don't have anything. They may have taken pictures there, they may have other things, but they've been through 3 divorces or whatever, and stuff disappears. But I consider myself lucky to have this stuff. So I built I filled sandbags, built bunkers, and I was working in Memphis a few years ago when the Mississippi River was flooding, and they put out a call for people to help come fill sandbags. So I took a picture of me filling sandbags to prove my credentials, and I helped fill sandbags for an hour to hold back the Mississippi.
So do you have any particular story that you would like to share about an instance of bravery, camaraderie, or just something that you think would inspire people?
Well, what I always tried to do was just do my job and stay in the background, and I never did anything particularly brave. If you're asking if I ever did anything, I did my job. The only thing that might be considered brave of me, but I really don't, in trying to recover the body that I briefly mentioned of my assistant gunner. And there had been a patrol out. He was on that patrol and I wasn't. And coming back, he got killed right at the wire, because you have barbed wire, concertina wire, coils of wire that surround the whole hill, 40 yards below the crest of the hill, the trench line and the bunkers. And the hill right there was quite steep. And he got killed. The patrol basically got chased back in, and they didn't recover his body. This was late in the day, in early July, when we were having all that trouble on that hill. And after dark, I said, well, I'll go down, tie a rope around his body, and we'll haul him up. So I go down to the wire. It was dark. I didn't think there was anything particularly dangerous about it. I go down with the rope, and I got down to his body. And I'll never forget the flies that were buzzing around his body with the blood and all that, hearing the flies. I had only just started to tie the rope on when I heard a mortar fire. The pop of a mortar tube, we would call it. And I didn't think anything of it because mortar rounds would typically land up on the hill. A few seconds after hearing the pop of that mortar tube, suddenly there's a whoosh, and the mortar round lands right on the other side of his body. Now, steep hill, I wasn't standing up. I was kind of laying against the side of the hill where his body was laying next to me on the side of the hill where I was going to tie the rope on him. And I had just time when I heard the whoosh to roll away from it. And that's where I got the small piece of shrapnel in my back. But of course, that made me just scamper right back up the hill without waiting to tie the rope on. And then we recovered his body the next morning. The reason I don't consider that brave is because I didn't expect that there would be NVA coming up the hill and were somewhere there right below the wire, and they saw me just yards away. And they could have easily shot me, but that would have given away their position, and all hell would have broken loose on them from the guys that were just up on top of the hill waiting to haul the rope up. So they had radios, and their mortarmen were very good at putting mortar rounds right where they wanted them. They called in a mortar round on me, just like we would call in a mortar round on them. And it wasn't until a long time after that that I put that together, that they must have been right below the wire, because just a couple hours later, they snuck their way through the wire right there. And we had NVA within our perimeter that we then had to deal with, which is a whole nother story. And that, I ended up separated from everybody, and I had 3 NVA within 30 yards of me. But that wasn't particularly brave either. So that was the only thing that brave but not brave.
You were brave to even go down there.
Well, okay.
So, the war had some psychological effects on you. So, how did you can you explain these effects, and can you kind of tell us how you coped with them?
Well, you're getting into sensitive areas
Yeah.
there. Everybody who has lived through combat has been affected by it in some way.
Yeah.
Some are affected to the point where they can't function in society anymore. You hear about veteran suicides and crazy things that some might do, and then others who don't appear affected by it at all. A key word there is kind of appear affected. And I always thought that I was one of the ones who was not really affected to the point where it hindered my life. Things have changed somewhat, and it does seem to be having more of an effect on me these days. And I last year finally filed a claim with VA for PTSD. I filed a claim initially for hearing loss because of having that 3.5-inch rocket launcher going off next to my ear. And I do have hearing loss. And I got approved for 10%, which was $133 a month right away last spring. But then, after going to a couple reunions last year, I finally I've gone to reunions off and on over the years of Quezon Veterans Association and my battalion reunion and things like that. So I've kept in touch with some of the guys. Not everybody comes to reunions, but it's really been affecting me more. Last summer I put in a claim for PTSD. And as part of that, you go through an evaluation with a psychologist, and the psychologist said to me, well, describe an incident in Vietnam where you were either exposed to violent death or where you yourself came close to violent death. So I told her about the time that the other assistant gunner who got killed, we dove into a bunker when we were getting hit by big artillery. And 3 of us dove into this bunker. Fred Raines went in first, Trujillo went in second, and I came in third. And in a bunker that's on the outside of a perimeter, you have an opening in the front called the aperture where you would shoot at any attacking enemy from inside this bunker. Well, this artillery round landed right in front of that aperture, and shrapnel came in through the aperture. Fred Raines got hit by a piece in his cheek, popped his eyeball out. Trujillo got a piece through his helmet and into his brain, a 2-inch chunk and he was basically shoulder to shoulder with me as we were going into this bunker. I got nothing except his gray brain matter all over my uniform. So the psychologist said, that's enough, you don't need to say any more. That was all she needed to hear about the incident. But then you have to there's 3 things that are important in order to get compensation for either physical injury or mental injury. It's all basically the same. The 3 things you need are the incident in military, either what I just explained or an injury of some sort, whether it be a combat injury or an accident injury or whatever. You also need ongoing symptoms. For mental, it needs to be, things like irritability or flashbacks or inability to sleep, interfering with your sleep, thinking about it all the time. These are all symptoms. But then most important, you need to translate those symptoms into negative impacts on your life. So what's the result of not sleeping well? Well, it's irritability. I don't get along with my wife because I'm tired all the time. We argue all the time because I'm tired. That's not the case exactly, but there might be some of it. But that's an example of how you need to tie all these things together. And I think veterans have, along with police officers and such, a higher divorce rate. And it's connected with the kind of work that they do. A combat veteran or a police officer or whatever. So that's the negative impact on the life that results in divorce. It's especially around personal relationships and employability. I can't take direction from a boss because it reminds me of my old platoon commander who I hated or something like that. But again, in my case, that's not the case. But that's an example of how you need to tie these things together. Incident, symptoms, negative impact. So yes, we're all affected by experiences. We can be affected in a good way, affected in a bad way, affected in a neutral way, but everything that happens in our life affects us in some way.
You said that you also made kind of family-like bonds with other people in your platoon or just other friends that you made there. Can you a little bit go in more in depth with that?
Yeah, these reunions, and the Marine Corps seems to have a particularly strong camaraderie. Once a Marine, always a Marine, you may have heard that. The reunions that I go to, very few of them are other people that I actually served directly with and remember from Vietnam days or military days. Some of them are, but very few. Most of them are there who shared the same general experiences. We were all part of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment. So, we operated, did the same kinds of things. So we may not have been friends then, we may not have even known each other then, but because of those shared experiences, we're friends now.
So is there a particular message that you would like to share with future generations of students and teens from your experiences?
The military isn't for everybody, but I would suggest that for many students that they look into the military as part of looking much different from the world that is today in how general society looks at veterans. It's much better now. People now say to me on a regular basis, strangers that I pass on the street, "Thank you for your service." Last night at the hospital, when I was admitting my wife, I'm walking down the hallway and there's a young man and a young woman with him. He saw my hat, my military hat, and he says, "Thank you for your service," and shook my hand. That never happened when we came home. But I think what was big things in turning it around, there have been several things. Back in the early 80s, 1982, the Vietnam Memorial was dedicated in Washington. That went a long way towards changing society's impressions of Vietnam veterans in particular. Also in the mid-80s, there were Vietnam veteran welcome home parades in cities around the country. I marched in the New York City Vietnam Veteran Welcome Home Parade, and I have a DVD of that parade, which I will share with you also. A commercially produced video. It was on VHS tape when I encountered it, and I had it converted into digital. I appear in that video in 2 places, right at the beginning and more towards the end, marching in New York City. And of course, the more recent 9/11 and all that has furthered the looking at the veteran in a more positive way.
What do you think caused the increased awareness and appreciation?
Well, those things that I just said.
Yeah.
Yeah, the what it did was it made people aware of the fact that the veteran, the warrior, is separated from the war. The war itself can be unpopular, but it's a political. It puts the politicians, the warrior, the veteran who served, who did his duty, who did what he was told. We were looked at back then as inseparable with the war itself and the politicians. You know, we were all seen together as, you know, baby killers and you know, all this negative stuff. Some of it was true, but a majority of it was not really true. Most of us were, the great majority of us did not commit atrocities.
Yeah.
Atrocity is kind of part of the definition of war. You know, it's not a good part about war, but then there aren't many good parts about war. But it made people look at us veterans separate from the war itself.
What was your experience transitioning back into civilian life? Like, did you receive any aid? Like, how did that work?
There's a lot more now. There's transition help now, but there wasn't then. I left the field a couple of days before my rotation date, went back down to Da Nang, got on an airplane, a civilian airplane with female stewardesses out of Da Nang, and I think this probably happened to every departing flight. As the wheels lifted off the runway in Da Nang, a shout went up through every one of us, just cheered as we were leaving. And I got to California, and I spent 2 weeks at Treasure Island Naval Base. There were 2 islands in San Francisco Bay. Treasure Island Naval Base, which the bridge goes right over, and Alcatraz was the other island. So I was on Treasure Island, and it took 2 weeks to get me out of the Marine Corps because my time in the Marine Corps was up. Every morning we would get up, we'd clean the barracks, and by noon we were free to go off and do whatever we wanted to in San Francisco. And then I got on an airplane and came home. So there was no kind of transition, no guidance, no help, no mentoring or anything, no help with finding work. I came back to American Cyanamid and worked for a while when I got home. But I remember a day or two after I got home, it was at night, and I was sitting on the couch in the living room, and my cousin was there, and she's sitting next to me, and I said, "There's somebody on the front porch," and nobody else had heard anything. And a few seconds later, it came knock on the front door. It was a friend from across the street that had come over to visit, but I knew he was there. I heard or sensed or whatever that somebody was on the front porch. I took my brother to. My brother and I went to, I think, a Mets baseball game in those first weeks or whatever after I came home, and we were sitting in the cheap seats way up in the middle of nowhere in the outfield, totally exposed. And I was extremely nervous about being so exposed, even though there was no apparent danger, and just being that out in the open. I also had been used to being armed all the time. So within the first few weeks after coming home, I bought a .32 caliber automatic pistol. I also bought a 1968 Volkswagen, and I carried that pistol for about a year and a half, loaded in between the little, right next to my left knee, driver's area in the Volkswagen. Not because I intended any harm with it, but just because I had the need to be armed. But then after a year and a half or so, I gave it up. So, you know, it takes some, and I think I had a fairly smooth transition back into civilian life, even with those few little, you know, things. But some people had much more difficult time. They really did. Some people never did transition well back into civilian society. The VA hospitals, if you had time for it, they're always looking for volunteers at the VA hospitals. Yeah, it's a great experience to do things like that. What?
I did volunteer there once.
So, is there anything that your experiences in the war have taught you about like life in general, or is there any other thing you want to say about your experience?
Watch your back and be careful. I look back on my military experience, even though there were difficult times, as a positive thing. I stay involved in veterans issues. In addition to these reunions that I go to, I do this oral history stuff. I'm involved now with you guys and with the Rutgers Oral History Archives. I'm on the Middlesex County Veterans Advisory Council. We put on claims clinics, information clinics to veterans. So if I had thought of my military experience as a negative thing, I would have continued to put it behind me and try to forget it and not be involved in things like this. But because I consider it, a positive, even with all its negatives associated with it, I'm still involved. What is fairly common amongst us veterans is when we get out of the military, we put it behind us, we get off on career, family, things like that, and start a new life. And it's called, we hang the experience and memories up in the closet with our uniforms. And there they stay, and we move on. It's not until we get older that we then start to re-examine it, get re-involved. These organizations, they don't get a lot of young members. It's older members who are ready to get back into the military climate who join these organizations. Young ones may join, but they're not active. It's as they get older. When I was we had a mini reunion at Parris Island Boot Camp a number of years ago. Some of us, there was like 20 of us. We went down there to a hotel just outside Parris Island, and somebody knew the lieutenant colonel who was in charge of the firing range at Parris Island. And we were at the firing range this one day, we were there, and there were recruits there, firing their rifles. And at lunchtime, they sit on this concrete pad in formation, and they eat their box lunches. And this lieutenant colonel let us interact with these recruits. So we'd mingle through them and talk to groups of them. And the group that I was talking with, I said to them, I said, believe it or not, 20, 30, 40 years, many of you are going to have a desire to come back here and visit. And to a man, every one of them said, no, sir, when we leave here, sir, we're never coming back. I said, I'm sure my attitude was the same when I was in your place, but you change.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview today. And
You're very welcome, and I'm very happy you all are doing this.
Yeah, and we're looking forward to coming back and seeing like the letters and like some other things that you said you had.
Yeah, we'll set up when we can come back. And I've got you all connected with this post, and you'll be able to conduct interviews here. I'm going to give you the phone number of Anita.